people are angry and irrational because of social media. And when asked in June of last year what had contributed to the erosion of trust in politicians, which, as you know, is probably somewhere on the floor, former Prime Minister David Cameron came back with two words: social media. So nothing at all that he had done in office was in question there. Now, so we hear this rhetoric coming from politicians and we hear it coming from the media. But I do think that the field of media and communication scholarship has also relocated a lot of its analytical gaze to the content that's produced and circulates online. Now, whilst we urgently need to devote our attention to this, and that's very important work, but I think sometimes there does seem to be a kind of resigned sense that media are all powerful. They simply instruct us what to think, and the public don't have the capacity to resist at all, and therefore we don't really need to engage with what they're saying or what they're doing. Of course, that's not true of all media scholarship, but I think thinking about the field very broadly defined, and I know it sits across a whole range of different disciplines, it's kind of a fair criticism. And so my question would be, how did we get here? Well, to very crudely summarize a very complex history, there's always been, in studies of media and communications, a kind of pendulum swing between audience power and media power. And it's kind of back and forth across the years. If we go back to the thinking of the Frankfurt School, for example, we see a one-dimensional man subject to the influence of a mass media that obfuscates the realities of capitalist domination and sates our appetites for the spectacle with the promise of popular culture. Now, this sense of audiences as dupes, and I should emphasize here that I think that is a really crude characterization of the work of the Frankfurt School, which I really like a lot, but that is the way it was sort of categorized and then sort of responded to in the 80s and the 90s by a body of empirical research, which, as I see it, was instigated largely by a misunderstanding of Hall's encoding and decoding model, but they emphasized the way in which social locatedness, language, culture, and the everyday active exchanges of audience groups produce new interpretations, which is very good as far as I can see, but with the implication that they were regularly and kind of routinely resisting media power, which I don't think is quite right. So it doesn't really sit as well for me. Now, meanwhile, the Glasgow University Media Group, as I was saying, had kind of made its name on the strength of these content analyses, which really focused on media as a mechanism for state control. And responding to this changing field, then developed their three-dimensional model, as I said, of media production, content, and reception. And for those of you who know the media group, I know it's not always thought of like this, but I do think actually this work represents a kind of third way on this question, actually, of media power, audience power. And in fact, is in some ways truer to Hall's claim that media power is articulated in practice in that the way in which it connects, or indeed it disconnects with audiences, under specific conditions, produce real effects. So power has to be seen at the other side. It's not just something that the media can do all alone. Now, the whole lens on this has changed totally. That's because digital technologies came along, blew everything else away, quite rightly instigated a rethinking of our conceptual and our methodological toolbox. But I would argue it has led to a rather narrow focus and approach. And having conducted over a decade of focus group research, this was mainly in the UK, starting in 2011, but I did do some research in the US in 2015, 2016, which is the period we now see as in the run-up to Trump being elected, but that wasn't necessarily the reason I was there, but I could see it right coming through as I was there. But having done all that, it was very clear to me that the media's role in social change must be understood in the context of cultural formations, value systems, and the socioeconomic conditions under which people live, and not just by looking at what goes on online. Okay, so the first task for this work then is to locate these processes of opinion formation in their own socio-historic context. So the period of my research, as I said, starting in 2011, is one of significant political and social change. We've got the rise of Trump, and then obviously more recently the re-election of Trump. With Brexit in 2016, in this period, we've seen increasingly felt climate impacts. COVID, of course, 2020 and onwards, and then right at the very end, the cost of living crisis, still going on now, located in an increasingly crisis-prone politics of neoliberalism and facilitated by and articulated through a media system transformed by digital technologies. Now, whilst these political and technological changes are distinct, they have developed in parallel over this period, and I think we need to see them as interconnected. Now, this is quite complex, and I talk quite a bit about this in the book, but one of the aspects of this which I think is important is in their constructed sense of enhanced freedoms. So in the case of social media, the freedom to get heard, to have a voice, to go anywhere you want for information. In the case of neoliberal politics, the freedom to work wherever and whenever you want, freedom to choose the best healthcare, the best schools, best education, perhaps most significantly, freedom of unregulated markets, which produces more financially robust economies and financialized subjects, at least in theory, because looking under the cover, people have in fact been subject to ever more intense forms of control, and we have actually seen a greater conformity of thought and behaviour. Now, the question of this kind of gap between the promise and the reality of neoliberal politics and of social media have had huge implications for the media institutions that dominated in the 20th century, though in quite distinct ways. Sorry, that should relate to the previous. I've already said that. Coming back to, as I say, this kind of gap between neoliberal politics, social media, obviously freedom being a big part of that. And this moves me on to this question of trust. Trust has been a central topic of media scholars in recent years. Indeed, we would almost say it's been an obsession, if not a preoccupation. And of course it should have been, because it's been vastly eroded. And in the book, I draw on a range of key thinkers to try to ground this question of trust a bit more sociologically. And one of these is the great sociologist Simmel. And Simmel notes that trust is not only necessary for society, indeed he presciently said that societies disintegrate without it, might be what we're kind of seeing now, but trust is also produced through society. So people learn to become trusting as they observe and develop an expectation of consistency in the way in which institutions and agents act. But crucially for him, this consistency in action must be perceived to be in the common good and the common interest. So trust has at its heart an expectation of positive intent. And if social institutions are understood to be historically reliable in this way, less direct knowledge and observation become necessary. And here trust relies on what Simmel calls suspension and what we might call a leap of faith. Now, trust in media and journalism, of course, is founded upon conceptualizations of the fourth estate, where journalists' adherence to a professional ideology or a set of norms, which historically have placed a sense of objectivity and truth-seeking at the centre, and then, of course, play out in the kind of generic conventions of news reporting, broadcasting, how they are expected to look and how they are expected to sound. And here, trust, again, is founded on a leap of faith because, of course, audiences are not there in the corridors of power when decisions are getting made. They can't travel over to Ukraine to find out firsthand what's actually going on in a war or conflict zone. So they are totally reliant. They have no direct knowledge and experience, so they're reliant on those who do. Now, digital technologies came along. They offered alternatives. And if the demystification of journalistic objectivity was once the preserve of a select band of academics, I guess, like the Media Group and others, in the digital age, the constructed nature of news was made publicly visible. This sense that these versions that they're bringing back are not the true or the only version. But to me, this is contextual and it's not causal. And this is a really important point because it's not a given that trust evaporates simply because people understand that news is constructed and selections had to be made. To some degree, they must have understood that anyway. The important thing is this question of having good intent and whether people feel that their interests are being represented by those who are delivering that information to them. And this takes me to a central argument of the book then. And that is that in this time, we've seen the emergence of a disconnect between mainstream media as the primary mechanism for promoting the promises and the solutions of neoliberalism and people's real-world experiences of the system and the outcomes it actually produces. So greater freedom in work has led to greater insecurity. Greater choice in healthcare has led people to go private in desperation. Greater freedom of markets, question of deregulation, has left people unable to get on the property ladder in crippling debt and in an increasingly crisis-prone economy. Now, thinking back to media and where they come in, I think there are two aspects of this which are important. The first one of these is the way in which journalists tend to speak, mainstream journalists tend to speak the language of neoliberalism. So this is a set of financialized terms, metrics, and metaphors that are designed to obfuscate and are totally remote from people's realities. So who cares about GDP if you're starving, right? Why should we care about the economy doing so well if we're all doing worse? And something that I think young people care about in particular, not exclusively, but in particular, I think, is why should I care about endless economic growth when climate change threatens the future of the planet? So just a kind of sort of remoteness from what people really care about. And the second is what I describe as a kind of mismatch in respect of how journalists present public opinion as something that they are there to actually represent and acting in the public interest, and what people think, care about, and actually believe. And I give examples of this in the book. So, for example, the mismatch was very much in evidence in the early days of COVID, because this was when we were really responding to the virus very quickly, when death tolls are rising, where in the daily Westminster briefings, and in fact in all the news reports, TV and radio, and specials, question time specials, if you remember, there were quite a few of those going on at the time as well. One question was omnipresent, and that question was, when will the lockdown end? In fact, on March 24th, when the lockdown and the other restrictions were actually announced, 93% of the British public actually supported those measures. And even later on in that year, September 2020, the majority felt that restrictions were actually being lifted too early. Now, in that case, the usual cycle of media sort of demanding response and action from politicians was disrupted. I wrote about this actually. There's a wonderful moment where a Five Live journalist is asking these questions and suddenly says, by the way, nobody is phoning in and asking about this at all. We're just talking about it. So, maybe something has slightly gone wrong. But I think, their public opinion was too robust really in the opposite direction. But we see this all the time. I mean, most recently in the last year's British general election, journalists almost kind of gleefully, quite boringly, I've got to say, repeated gotchas to Labour about raising tax. Every single question was, are you going to raise tax? Are you going to raise tax? Are you raising tax to pay for this? And this is on the basis that the public are demanding to know. Whilst later surveys actually showed most people don't mind if taxes rise, if it actually improves public services. Of course, that is a condition. But it's just not a priority anyway. They have other priorities, and rising taxation was not necessarily one of them. So we have journalists representing public opinion. They do this through all sorts of different discursive mechanisms with often no foundation and evidence. And so we have this growing gap between what's represented as public opinion and what politicians are asked to respond to, and then what the public actually think, believe, and care about. And it's growing and growing. And this disconnect was in evidence across all of my research. It was particularly acute in 2015, 2016. But I think a key point here is that there was really no mechanism for factoring in the real experiences of the public who lived the failures of politics and a largely neoliberal media. This is to do with arguments about a very narrow journalistic class, a very sort of rigid news agenda that even when they have, those phone-ins or question time where the public are supposed to be asking the questions, they just select the questions to match the agenda. It's for many people, and you hear this all the time, people just don't feel listened to or represented in that kind of media. And here, in this respect, I draw on a Gramscian approach, and I argue that, an important part of any hegemonic political programme is in accommodating and containing growing dissent as part of that ongoing struggle to win consent, right? And so what he called flashes of discontent spring up. The space for alternative voices open up, and then they must somehow be absorbed into the system, either by amending what is on offer, reworking the ideas which circulate to support what politicians are doing. And these flashes hold the potential for social change, although where they're going to land is actually fairly unpredictable. Okay. If we see ourselves now then deep in this extended hegemonic moment, unfortunately, largely the beneficiaries have been the far right, even more so since I wrote the book. In the book, I do include a section on Trump. It's fairly complex. It was obviously written before he took office again. But one of the things I was looking at there was the way in which Trump mirrors and amplifies people's articulation of their discontent with the system. And I did a comparative analysis of his own rhetoric from his speeches in those early days and focus group data of my own. And I show in the book exactly how he does this in people's words, in their metaphors, in their framings. He mirrors them, he gives them back what they're already saying. And of course, he does all this in the places where they go for information. I mean, looking back at my analyses now of that kind of first term or that earlier period, I think what's really alarming actually is the way in which over that time his kind of railing against an elitist and a rigged system and the delegitimizing of public institutions, which was done over a period of time, has now paved the way for his dismantling of them as part of his political programme. And of course, he's carrying a hell of a lot more cultural power now because he has Elon Musk as the the owner of X, and that's a very sort of powerful combination. But I think it's worth saying that this disconnect was evident across all of my focus groups. I think it's really, really important. It wasn't just Trump supporters. It's not just reform supporters. It's not just people that are going to the far right. I can tell you that having just done some focus groups on the cost of living crisis, they're not included in the book, they're right up to date, but it's ever more acute now. But this is experienced to different degrees by different groups in society and in different ways. These differences relate to questions of class, education, age, ethnicity, and so on and so forth, not in simple ways. And the degree to which the disconnect is felt also plays a role in how much individuals and communities turn to and invest trust in the alternatives offered by digital media, YouTube, X, TikTok, Facebook, podcasts, and those who experience the feelings of marginalisation and powerlessness produced by this gap between between the promise and the reality most intensively, are likely to be pushed furthest away from a mainstream media which no longer speaks to them or for them. But where people might go, of course, they've got many, many places they might go, lots of platforms, lots of information sources where they might go for trusted information and who they might listen to, and then what they might actually come to believe is not inevitable. So the question becomes, why did some people fall for disinformation or conspiracy theories and others don't? And what are the range of factors that produce differentiated responses? Okay, and as one of the things I wanted to do with my book was to develop a way of examining these questions in a more systematic way. And so I developed an inductive model, draws on the hundreds of hours of empirical research I've done. And this operates across 6 different filters, which show how different modes of media engagement dynamically interact with ideology, value systems, online and offline communities, identity, and lived experience to produce patterns in opinion and belief. I obviously don't have much time to get into all of this in depth. There's quite a lot there. The chapter 2 in the book is where you should go if you're interested in reading more about it. But what I'll do is I'll just give a few headlines about some of the key filters and the way in which they might interact. So the first filter is ideology. I think it's incredibly important. It's there at the very start. I see ideology as built into our institutions. It's there in the language we use. And of course, media is understood as a key mechanism for its transmission. I'm defining ideology as a lens through which social relations in society are perceived as common sense or inevitable, following Gramsci, following Stuart Hall, or what Mark Fisher, the late Mark Fisher, said in 2009, or what he described as capitalist realism, and that's the sense that there is no viable alternative to the system that we currently have. People can't imagine it. And the degree to which people invest in ideology and these ideas is dependent on the position they hold in society, their income, their job, their access to opportunity, and how much they believe they benefit from society as it is. So at a most basic level, then, ideology is kind of stakes in the system. It's how much people have invested in it, and crucially, what they perceive they would lose if things were to change. And I see constant articulations of how this works in relation to, say, climate change, which I talk about a lot in my focus groups. People would begin with the sense, of course, climate action has to happen. It's really important. It's all happening. You know, the science is there. Most people do believe the science, actually. But then they start to caution of doing too much due to a fear of losing freedoms, losing economic gains in this highly competitive environment. And this extends to other areas of policy and action as well. So, you know, whilst my evidence and other evidence out there as well, I think, suggests that people are, really very much desiring some political change. Alternatives which don't promise to protect the benefits of competitive employment, home, education, and markets largely resisted by the majority. That is because people are programmed to kind of focus on what they might lose, and that instills a fear of change, and they often conclude that there is no real alternative to the system that we have. It's interesting the way in which Trump does this, and he sort of does this almost in retrospect. So, what he does really well, it's kind of ideological warfare, I think, is to construct a sense of loss or threat around status, financial security, opportunity, identity, culture, to lead people to demand change, because he creates a perception that those are things that they have lost. Here, people are persuaded they need to claw something back for this lost kind of ideal society. And he also has a very strong call on freedoms here as he further restricts it. So, doing the ideological work perhaps in a slightly different way, but that sense of threat or fear of loss, of change or change that's already happened. So ideology being a founding consideration when people assess new ideas about how society should be. Okay, secondly, I want to talk about two of the filters, which are both interrelated. This is interpersonal communication and identity and alignment. And this relates really to my main objective in writing this book, I suppose, which was to update existing models of how mainstream media influences public opinion, which is largely about the control of information, amplifying particular perspectives, marginalising others, to an understanding of the new mechanisms for governing opinion and thought in social media environments, not in any way to imply that control of information isn't important or continue to be a way in which media can influence, but just that there's something different going on as well. By interpersonal communities, and this is not in any way something that is new to audience reception, it's been talked about since the 40s with Merton and Lazarsfeld and people like that. But here I'm referring to the communities that are naturally occurring. So these are, the people that we meet that we don't choose to meet, our family networks, the people we meet through work, our colleagues, the people we meet through university and school, the people we talk to in the pub. And this is about how communities organised around shared language, shared experiences, shared locations might generate distinct interpretations of what's going on in the world. And how this influence works rests on a very basic sociological principle, which is people learn the norms of opinion and thought and behaviour from the people around us and the institutions we exist in. By identity and alignment, I'm more focused on those communities which are self-selecting rather than originating in physical settings or those we don't have a choice over. Although, of course, it's worthwhile saying that they do overlap, and I talk about this in the book and make that clear. But these communities tend to organise more around common political beliefs, identity categories, shared interests, and the way in which influence operates here is more about self-projection. These are the people that we imagine ourselves to be, that we want to be, how we would like to be seen in the world. And I was most interested in the way in which both these forms of influence are amplified by their location in social media environments and the volume and immersion of access to these opinions, views, and interpretations. So if social media exchanges resemble offline everyday conversations in some ways, the qualitative difference lies in the number of comments and the potential to expand interpersonal networks to friends of friends, to colleagues of colleagues. Even if they live on the other side of the world, they feel like friends sometimes because of those connections that are made. They might be speaking our language. And if people learn the norms of behaviour from the people around them, this is significantly exaggerated as the sheer volume of comments access constructs a broader sense of representativeness and present thoughts or experiences which appear to be common, to be acceptable, to be normal. A word that came up a lot in my focus groups was validation. I have this little quote here from my focus group, one of my focus groups. It's validation. It's a personal thing. If you're thinking it's not accurate or whatever, and then you compare your thoughts with somebody else, it validates it. Now, when it comes to identity and alignment, was the degree to which social media users construct their landscapes in kind of ways that mirror their own identity and image, I think, filter bubbles, echo chambers that restrict access to any counter positions. I don't think the academic literature evidences that. I don't personally do that work, but I don't think it does. But certainly commonalities in respect of similar beliefs, ideas, and issues is clearly evidenced in the literature. And again, these are questions of how might I be seen? How do I want to be seen? Who would I upset if I say the wrong thing? What may be the consequences of that? And that's all amplified many times where these groups include thousands, millions maybe, of like-minded people liking and posting endorsements. Now, I'm probably slightly more optimistic about these new communities of thought and opinion and what they can achieve. I'll come back to that. But there is no question here, this is probably the hub of everything, that many people in the rejection of an institutionalized media to get to the truth without an agenda, to get insight straight from the horse's mouth, to move away from that really remote language, have reorientated themselves to a platformized culture, which is every bit as controlled by those with power and resources. Big tech, Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, we're seeing all this now, AI and human moderators, foreign bots, new forms of propaganda, the influence industry, they all promote, amplify, hide away, delete content in ways which build in bias and distort and obscure any organic narrative from real users which might emerge. When, of course, you add in identity management, self-branding, intense self-censorship, I've got a lot of data on that, it's limited in potential anyway. So freedom of speech was just another false freedom. I'd say that Elon Musk has to some degree exposed the myth of neutrality in terms of that organic articulation of public thought. People are not naive to how platforms work, but the controlling mechanisms are still largely known but not seen. And when we go on these platforms, what we get in essence is a kind of impression of what other people think, often people just like us, and also what they're liking, what they're reading, what they're endorsing. And I think that's immensely powerful. The final point I want to make in terms of my model, and I'm going to do this quite succinctly, relates to, this is my final filter, and this is lived experience. By this, I mean an understanding of the world gained through direct personal involvement or observation of events in day-to-day life. Now, it might seem obvious that lived experience is the ultimate and trusted sources and would win over any media information source, but of course we can't assume that lived experience comes to us unmediated and its meaning always recognizable, because of course it's always entangled with the other filters. And in my book, I use an analogy. If we're confronted with a long, thin piece of wood, hence my little picture here, and a broad consensus of public media, expert voices and the collectives, the relatable sources that we go to for verification, tell us it's a poker for the fire, we're likely to accept that. If we're told by those same sources it's a table, then because we've heard it so many times and we rely and trust these people, it's a good possibility we accept that legs are simply missing. But if we're told that this plank of wood is a skipping rope, after repeated attempts to skip over it, the evidence from our own experience may be said to be striking and is likely to overwhelm all other sources. I've seen examples of this where people long-held beliefs, many years-held beliefs are, kind of just evaporate in the face of lived experience. A good example being the benefit system in this country. People have read for years, it's overly generous, people are living the life Riley on the benefit system, and then they become unemployed and they cannot believe the reality of life on benefits. It's horrible and it's difficult. And so all of that just kind of crumbles. But actually, I've more often seen the opposite, because striking experience doesn't usually come to us like that. And actually, this is where people just take out their own experience as exceptional, take it out as credible evidence, and basically say, oh yeah, that happened, but that was just a one-off. That's not really how it is. And I give I give examples of this in the book. I think ultimately this is a really simple point. The more people are told the same thing across multiple sites, across multiple sources that they trust and rely upon, the more they're going to absorb it. It's more likely to be the 50th time they are told something that seals the deal, not the first time. Okay, so this is my final slide, and hopefully I've got 5 minutes left to do it. Finally, a key message of my book is a warning about increasingly controlled conditions under which we make decisions now, and alienation from our own experience, which I think is really real. I should also say that the advent of AI, something which is even less transparent, less regulated currently than social media, will inevitably control our thought even more than it already is controlled by social media, as we lose the capacity to think critically and hand decision-making over to digital technologies. That is the trajectory we are on unless we do something about it, albeit I know that's really difficult. But coming back to the current time through application of the model that I've set out, I do have moments of optimism in this book, as I do also try to identify, those moments of resistance, rejection, reworking, which can, if collectively expressed, produce demands for change. This is about using the filters that we have. So first I'd say a linguistic and narrative turn, which speaks to the no alternative ideology, a new way of talking about the economy, which replaces the old and tired way of talking about it that people are alienated from, trying to have a proper critique and a proper discussion about how the economy might work for people. For me, as I said, a key aspect of this is challenging and reworking ideas of freedom. Maybe we can learn from the historic process by which smoking became a largely stigmatized and minority activity, where freedom to smoke was ideologically reworked as freedom from smoke. What can climate activists, for example, do about that? Because at the moment, the climate narrative, which is winning people over, is all about loss, all about lack of freedom, all about taking away your mate, taking away your flying, etc., etc. Got to kind of turn that on its head a bit. Second, a societal move towards reconnecting with lived experience is already happening with mobile phones in schools in Australia. And, we've seen millions of people leave X, right? I think there's just an assumption they're going to another social media platform. Maybe they are, but it's possible that and they're not going offline, I know, but it's possible that they're just not going to another social media platform. I know plenty of people that have said this to me, it's just ad hoc, but potentially, where's the movement? What are people doing? Can you grab them as they move somewhere else? And finally, building momentum around the online opinion communities that are already there. So, for example, in the book, I have a section on the youth climate community organising on TikTok and Instagram. It draws on a completely different and new form of political communications, a whole different way of thinking about the economy and what we should be aiming for and what societies should aspire to be. I think these groups can be influential. They have been within their peer group. And of course, that's the online community that produced Greta Thunberg. And of course, Greta Thunberg made the leap from these communities to the mainstream in quite effective ways, talking to politicians and things. But I do sound a note of caution as well, because these online movements and their rejection of news can actually sometimes be a little adrift from policy on the ground, from what decision makers, from what politicians are actually doing. As I say, in some ways it's quite good, but also there's a kind of lack of a political literacy there. And I think if you're going to call out politicians or the system or other things, you need to actually have a clear idea of what's wrong, rather than a vague kind of, well, we know roughly they should be doing this. I think it needs to be kind of more connected. And I do think as well, it's important that we try to bring people back to some sort of communicative course, some consensual sense of what reality is, which is obviously being challenged by the right and Trump in particular at the moment. I just don't see how there can be a collective consciousness and consensual perspectives for change without that anchoring. But the key here for me is that this kind of dismantling of public trust has happened over a number of years, and there were real reasons for it. So to build it up again is going to take a bit of time, and it's going to have to work across multiple sites. But fundamentally, building trust on that perception of good intent, and all of the filters, have to be in place for that to work. Okay, I shall stop there and maybe come back to not sharing my screen.
Cool, right. Okay, thank you, Catherine. That's really kind of revealing a lot. It offers quite a different way to think about what is happening. I'm just open the floor to anybody to have any comments or questions to Catherine.
That's me. I'm stop sharing now. Took me a while.
Yep.
Sorry.
Cool. Rick, you have a question?
Okay. There's quite a few things in the chat I can see, but I haven't had time, obviously, to. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. I just put something into the chat, but it was basically why is there that disconnect between, say, traditional media and what the public are interested in? Is it poorly trained journalists? Is it pressure from the media bosses? Is it pressure from government? Do you have any insight into that at all?
The reason why there is that kind of disconnect, and I continue. Sorry, I was reading this as well, but I think the reason why journalists continue to kind of operate in this way that constructs the disconnect, was that broadly?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Well, this is the way in which journalists have been trained. There's a very kind of narrow class of journalists. I'm talking about mainstream journalists very much at the top. I think if we were talking about local journalism, there'd be a whole range of different questions. They are much more connected with their audiences. And so this is very much, your kind of BBC One news reporting, your radio, the kind of mainstream at that level. They've been trained to talk like this. All of the, they're very closely connected with politicians who also talk like this. Think tanks that they engage with also talk like this. This is the language that works in that kind of circular way. And of course, there's that kind of circuit of representing politicians and politicians being primary definers lead the news agenda. So what they say in their policy statements, in their discussions, what they give to newspapers is also in this language. So in some ways, it's just so deeply embedded, it's very, very difficult for them to kind of step back from that. There's no question that some journalists do attempt to do that, and I am very much of the opinion that the media environment should also be seen as a site of conflict. It's not all one way, but there is a kind of dominant strain of talking about the economy, which is as I say, it's just the language of journalism. To be honest, to be successful in that environment, you have to speak like that. You have to learn to speak like that. There's a lot of work being done by people like Mike Berry and Tom Mills, looking at the way in which contributors are largely drawn from the financial community as well. Really worth looking at that, those studies, and show the connections between these different groups. But I just think it's the way journalists are trained. And of course, if you don't speak like that, you're not going to have access to the media.
Thank you.
Penelope's asked a question. Could she say it so that I can respond?
Can I follow up a little bit on that before I move to the next question? Okay. Isn't it part of a very general anti-establishment movement that have been going on for several decades now? It's not just the media, isn't it? It's not just journalists. It's science. It's politics.
Sure.
It's anybody who actually, have powers or some sort of, symbolic or material powers in society. And this is why Trump exploited so well. He did, he's a master in exploiting all of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said at the very end there, this is something that's not happened overnight with Trump. There's been a progressive dismantling of elite, a kind of critique of elite knowledge and a way of questioning, I guess, almost the kind of foundations of reality. I actually do think in some ways social scientists have to take some responsibility for that, because that's how we train our students to think, right? We critique objectivity as well. But in terms of the kind of dismantling of trust in elites, in public institutions, obviously the legal system being a big part of it. That's been happening on Fox News. It's been happening in the Daily Mail. It's been happening, for years and years and years. Nigel Farage was talking about this 20 years ago, right? And it's kind of built up across all of these different sites and kind of come to a head. The problem is that sometimes that connects with people because, of course, they do have very little trust in some of these institutions for the reasons I've given. So yes, there's a problem in the system anyway, but it's been amplified, it's been distorted, it's been capitalized upon by these right-wing actors, and that's where they've been incredibly successful. But to kind of win trust back, of course, you've got to kind of bring people back in. You've got to make change to kind of respond to that in some way. But certainly, there are kind of groups that have been caught in the crossfire, like scientists. Actually scientists are still largely trusted, but they often get brought into that discourse in very unfair ways. That's something that the kind of negative narratives on climate change draw on very heavily, and scientists are battling it. I still think scientists are trusted more than almost any other group in society, but it's a constant battle for them to kind of keep that going, and it's complex.
Yeah, thank you. Rethinking economics. Do you want to speak up asking your question? Sorry, I don't know your name.
Sorry, it was Penelope had the question. I don't mind responding to that one. Okay, she's there. I can respond to it. I just want to know more detail about what seems outdated, because I don't know which part is outdated. This is right up to date research. This is what everybody is saying to me all of the time. So I'm just, which part's outdated? Does she have an answer, or is she there? I just don't know which part's outdated. I mean, I literally speak to people last week, and this is exactly what they are saying. If people don't think there's a disconnect, then I'm sorry, but you're so wrong. Go out and speak to people in the street. That's all I can say to that one. Really, this is what they tell me. They tell me in focus groups. I've done focus groups across the country again. This is what we get. There's no trust. The system is failing. We need change. So I don't know if Penelope's there.
Okay,
we all wish it were different, but it's not true.
Okay. You want to ask the question? Sorry, I don't know what's your name, but rethinking. Okay.
Hi, yes. Sorry, I can't change my name. So this is my organization, Rethinking Economics. My name's Lawrence, and I'm the executive director of Rethinking Economics International. So my question was basically the context of it is that we are putting together a network of social media influencers that are working across climate and economics. And we're trying to think about how we can basically do some capacity building to get them both better able to communicate on social media, specifically video production as well. So, TikTok, Instagram.
Yeah.
And I guess I was interested to know if you've got any like general advice on how people should be speaking about the economy to attract audiences, and more public audiences as well. So,
Yeah.
obviously, like people can kind of connect with some of the existing activists, but like, how do we kind of like break outside of those bubbles? Yeah, I think that's probably it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I absolutely think that's a really valuable piece of work to be doing, and I think there are real opportunities there in this social media environments because I think they can actually be very influential and they can extend beyond their environment. And I do think, there are whole groups of young people who never engage with mainstream media, so they're getting their kind of forms of language, their metaphors, their ways of thinking from social media. I'm not sure yet there is a kind of really clear or coherent new narrative on the economy, but to me it absolutely has to be about talking about, there are donut economics and all the rest of it, and I think there's a lot out there that's really, really valuable as well, but it's thinking about the way in which we develop a story about the economy, a sustainable economy obviously being absolutely part of this, and the way in which it benefits people and the kind of life that we want to live. I think those are probably the ideas that are out there, but I would add to that any political program or any political narrative that doesn't promise to protect or secure rights or freedoms is not going to work, right? And I think one of the things that the left had done wrong, probably in recent years, was to not have a narrative on freedom. If anything, actually, the kind of language and the discussion was about losing freedoms. And to be honest, that's not going to work for people. So I think this question of freedom has absolutely got to be central to any new narrative on this. And I think maybe some of these arguments were much more about protections rather than freedoms, but I think there can be that reworking because protections are freedoms. If you're talking about pollution, for example, protecting people from that is a freedom. It's a freedom to breathe freely. It's a freedom to be healthier. It's a freedom to actually live your life the way you want and not dying early because of the air you live in. So I definitely think there's something about reworking the narrative on freedom, and building that in much more strongly. And also maybe some groups have been somewhat exclusive and not as inclusive in their way of addressing people. There's been, I don't know if you've been seeing what Ash Sarkar was saying this week or whether you agree with that or not, but she was talking about the kind of policing of language and moving to the extremes and the niche position almost too easily. I have some sympathy with that. And actually the third chapter in my book talks a little bit about that sort of policing of language and the focus on language. Actually, we need to bring back experience. I think direct experience is a big part of this, but as I say, I think freedom to me is incredibly important. People want freedoms. I think I did some work on media communications and meat consumption, and we were talking about how you kind of sell this to people. I saw an article in The Guardian today saying you need to lose 2 kebabs a week or something. People don't want to lose 2 kebabs a week. So the angle there is, here's ways in which you can eat healthier, live longer. Here's brilliant recipes for plant-based diets, etc., etc. It's back to front, So it's about giving people something. If you are trying to persuade people, why is it in their interest to believe you? They've got to be getting something out of it. If they're just told that they're losing everything for this greater principle, that doesn't work for most people. Some people are very, all about integrity, all about principle. And do you know what? That's not most of us. Most people have interests that they want met. So it's about thinking the way in which we can try to persuade people through identifying what those interests are without losing what it is we actually need to do to achieve this better economy and persuade people to get on board.
I think you're right on the money. We actually just reframed our strategy around freedom from. So I was like so delighted to see that. So I think, yeah, and just to say as well, like It's totally true. We've moved towards TikTok and Instagram as a place to organize now because that's where all of our members receive. People don't even receive information from Twitter anymore or X or whatever you want to call it. It's like video production is how they're getting the news. But yeah, great. Thank you.
TikTok comes up all the time, actually. I mean, I've seen our focus groups, TikTok actually and Instagram a lot.
Okay, thank you. We have 4 minutes, so Nahid, you want to ask the question? And then Raham, you have another question?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you so much for providing the opportunity, Catherine. It was really nice to hear you. And it resonates with my own research. I'm working on political narratives of political parties in my country on social media, actually. So in that thing, I'm also looking at how journalists are also playing the part for framing the narratives which political parties are trying to frame as well. So the journalists who were there on mainstream media, they were famous, but mainstream media in the country is not that much popular because of the understanding that they were becoming sold outlets of political parties, you can say. So now people have started believing in social media, but the journalists are over there as well. They are impacting the what do you say, like public opinion again. So how do you see this in terms of journalists when they are posting biased things on social media?
So the question is about, so I think there was actually a bit where you cut out, so I was just trying to work out, you were saying that journalists or the media said mainstream media were too aligned with particular political parties, but actually when those journalists make their way onto social media, once again, they're really, kind of giving the political narrative. Well, I mean, I think the sort of the idea that the mainstream media is or the influence of the mainstream media and the kind of power relations underpinning that have been sort of obliterated by social media is very much exaggerated, because an awful lot of what happened on mainstream media has just been translated into social media. And of course, journalists go on there, they're not necessarily representing, or at least they're not supposed to be representing particular political parties or particular news outlets, but it's almost been impossible for those individuals and those groups to actually sever those ties, partly because they're working in professional organizations, and there's a big editorial emphasis on getting your work out there on social media. It's a big part of what journalists are asked to do now. This becomes part of their job, part of their branding as journalists, part of the promotions of the outlets. So in many, many ways, if you've got, a professional journalist working in a mainstream media environment, I don't think necessarily you're going to get anything other than largely the editorial slant and the interests they represent from what they were putting out on social media either. So I kind of see them as, you've got obviously a number of alternative media outlets, but social media, and particularly so on X, for example, since Elon Musk took over, those with resources, those who can pay for verification, those who already had a following built up because of their broadcast profile, automatically have more influence and reach when they move into the social media environment. So in many, many ways, take, for example, somebody who's often talked about as an alternative voice, Russell Brand, for example. Russell Brand is a classic model here. He built up his following on mainstream media as a personality, albeit he's doing something different now. I'm not paying attention. I don't really want to, but and had this massive following when he moved to social media. Somebody who didn't have that backdrop didn't have it. I do think the group that probably are distinct here is the group that was mentioned before, and that's your social media influencers. Now, they usually have corporate backing, but they're not necessarily representing a set of political interests. Some of them in the political arena and some of them don't. But maybe, there is a role for those people to play, I think. Now, the problem is, as soon as people start to increase their influence and reach, they're then brought into some sort of corporate or political kind of organization in some way. They get that backing, they can make money, but not only that, they can extend their reach further. And so the whole system kind of, I don't know, it works in a kind of circular way, I think. I'm very, very cynical about the alternatives and how they find a voice or a platform on any of these on any of the social media.
Okay, Catherine. We kind of run out of time now, but maybe I can have another question if everybody is fine. The next question, Graham, you want to have another question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Really enjoyed it. Excellent stuff. I get the kind of sense that this is about how can we persuade people to believe what we want them to believe, what our group, our tribe believes, rather than the truth. I mean, I think a lot of people want the truth. And how can you get the truth if you're only feeding people one set of narratives and facts, whether it's on climate change or anything else? So shouldn't we be welcoming dissent and diversity of opinion and healthy debate in a democracy? Because it all sounds slightly kind of almost religious. It's like we've got to stamp out heretics.
I come from a value-based perspective, and I'm absolutely upfront about that, as does the media group, but that is not in any way what I am saying here. I mean, if you're talking about climate change as not being truth, then I strongly feel the science there is that it's truth. But there's no question, I actually have a lot more faith in the social media environment, I think, than a lot of other scholars working in this field who are trying to kind of get people to come back to a mainstream media as if that was truth and we should be returning to truth as pumped out by the BBC, by CNN or whatever. I absolutely don't think that. I think there should be space for dissent. I think we should be open to a whole range of different views. But what my analysis also does say that at the moment, those with great power and resources are restricting the possibility of doing that. So if you take X, for example, I recommend you read chapter 4 of my book because it talks about this exactly. It goes through all the ways in which the social media environment, which is supposed to allow for the broadest range of opinion and idea and dissent, is actually increasingly restricted by those with power and resources, i.e., the tech bros or whatever, and the right-wing politicians, because they have got much more sway in the digital media environment. So it's the opposite, actually. It's the way in which the digital infrastructure is actually weighted away from some of these arguments. But I absolutely don't want to see control of information. I'm opposed to that. And I don't have a clear steer on necessarily, what should be allowed, what shouldn't be allowed. I mean, harmful and abusive content, obviously, we need to probably do something about. Beyond that, I'd be very, very open. I'm absolutely opposed to the idea that we're trying to bring people back to some sort of sense of truth that, as I say, the mainstream media promoted before. I've spent my whole career critiquing that. But if you're saying that you want dissent, you want different ideas, for example, one of the topics that is very, very difficult to talk about on different social media platforms is on the Israel-Palestine question, because political interests get involved at the very top, the editorial of the platforms, for instance, Facebook. Again, I cover this in my book. And actually, it's that kind of talk that's being, so it's not left and right really here. I think I'm completely on the same page as you. I think we want reasonable debate. We want ideas to be freely flowing. But at the moment, they are not, because you've got particular actors with resources and political groups interfering in social media platform, constructing a sense of neutrality when it's not there. So it's trying to get back to something that looks a bit more open, actually, is my argument.
Oh, okay.
I have
Thank
my
you.
own beliefs, though,
Yep.
clearly. I have my own beliefs, but that's not the argument.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry that
Thanks for the question. It's a good one.
I'm sorry we have to stop it here, but thank you very much, Catherine, for fascinating talk. There are a few comments from who want to connect with you. So I copied them and I sent it to you. And
Oh, yeah, that's great.
two more questions there, but I mean, I have to do school run now, so I'm sorry. But thank you very much, and I'm very looking forward to reading the book. I already just ordered that for the library now, so every day I think it's going to be very, very, very good, fascinating talk. Read for us, I think. Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Much appreciated.